Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Spectre here. Another edition of Midnight Rider. Good to have you aboard. Tonight on the broadcast, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on in the financial realm. We're going to talk a little bit about Biden's Go Big plan from his State of the Union last week, if you want to call it that, the joint session of Congress, those that were invited. The Wrekt labor pool. We'll talk a little bit about minimum wage as well as what is going on with the gold situation. And of course what we know about gold versus the Fed. So that being said, we'll see you back here momentarily on the other side. As the saying goes, woke, go broke. We the people, the two woke corporate alliance, and 90 CEOs in a Zoom call, went on record to oppose election in Georgia. These corporations think they know what's best for we the people. These nations think they wield power we the people. Corporations openly flaunt the people. These corporations hide behind legal terms like personhood, thereby giving said corporations dead entities like we the people. Virtue signal at every opportunity what values should we the people have forgotten how to play the game, and it's time we the people step into the light of the great awakening. Have no. We the people have the ability to vote with our dollars. We the people have had enough of the fraud and are collectively throwing up the window. We're mad at hell. We the people keep our tongues from evil and our lips from speaking lies, while nations have given her mouth and her tongues frame deceit. We the people will have no fellow fruitful works of these corporations. Rather, we the people admonish them. We the people, having know our rights, are inherent and come by the hand of God, whereas these corporations are soulless and rely upon man for their privileges as rights. We the people will continue the destruction of the old guard. We the people around, through, and these. So help us God. This PSA by Breaking Spec. Alright, welcome back everybody. After the extended intro, of course, play the old woke corporations net. It's always good to understand who our enemies are, who do not have our best interest in mind. But again, tonight on the broadcast, if you're just now joining, appreciate you tuning in. For those of you on the YouTube side, good to have you aboard. Over on Twitch, we are up over there, D-Live as well. And of course, our friends over at the Tiger Network, good to have you aboard here this evening. And last but not least, we are up on Trovo Live as well as Vaughn Live this evening. So if by chance something ever happens to any one of these other channels, well, we've got a couple extra backups at the ready as well. That being said, let's just get into it here tonight. And again, we're going to be talking heavy on the financial side tonight, so be sure to like, share, subscribe as well. Get this information out far and wide. Again, digging back to last week, Biden and his stand-up act in front of Pelosi and Kamala and the 50 or so people, or however many were in attendance for the joint session, let's say. This article come out last week, says Biden's Go Big plan will leave America's middle class addicted to government and the Democratic Party. And if you look at what has been playing out, right, as a result of the whole COVID business, the shutting down of businesses against our will, of course, many of the blue states and whatnot, what has been happening? If you've been paying attention, you'll note that you're getting these stimulation checks, right, aka stimmies. That's what we'll call them from here out. And is this not just a manifestation of the mass monetary theory and that, and it's just being directly injected into your accounts? Think about that for a second as we go through this stuff here this evening. The Wall Street Journal's editorial board said it best. Biden's latest $1.8 trillion, T with a trillion, plan rejects the old social contract of work for benefits. So much for the safety net to prevent poverty. This is now about maintaining benefits to middle-class families so they become addicted to government and to the Democratic Party that has become the promoting agent of government. All this adds up to healthy, guaranteed annual income largely untied to the social contract that requires work, which is the real path to independence and self-respect. The new taxes are destructive, but their impact will take time to be felt as the post-pandemic economy soars. The GOP shouldn't ignore the taxes and spending. But a more potent political target may be the bills tripling down on a welfare state that disdains the dignity of work and seeks to make Americans the wards of government. Is that not what we're seeing play out at the moment? Taxing our way to prosperity, unity, applause, of course, that's what we saw. So as if that doesn't make you nervous, Conrad Black, via the National Interest, believes that Joe Biden's speech was a declaration of war on America. The best aspect of President Biden's speech to the nation from the House of Representatives was his competent and persuasive delivery. He once again beat back the claims that he is a senescent, robotic dummy of severely diminished cognitive abilities. It was just reading a teleprompter, but everyone remembers what an almost insurmountable challenge even that was at times in his candidacy, while the national political media conducted his campaign for him. He spoke to a sparse, well-distanced corporal's guard of well-masked and double-vaccinated legislators, signaling their doubts about vaccines and determination to continue lockdowns. COVID got Biden to the White House, but they all seemed absurd. And I find this picture rather interesting. Just the shot in of itself kind of reminds me of the old Catholic Jesus with the yellow halo around his head, as if to shape him as such. It's kind of odd. And I suspect that picture was shot that way on purpose. Just my opinion, though. It says he did not mention his predecessor, and his entire address for over an hour was based on the only argument the Democrats have put forward on their own behalf in the last 5 years: Trump hate. He assumed the headship of a nation in crisis in which our house was on fire, and we stared into the abyss of insurrection and autocracy, a pitiful and almost subliminal appeal to the Trump monster. The country had done nothing about immigration in 30 years, most of them under Clinton and Obama, except that under Trump, illegal immigration was reduced by 90%, and the principal problem was effectively solved until Biden stopped construction of the southern border wall and reopened the borders. He said it was time to do something about the Dreamers, but that was not the policy of his party when Trump attempted to help them. Biden called for resources to deal with the root cause of why people are fleeing Central America, as if it were the business of the United States to raise the welfare of those poor countries and feed more graft into them rather than to monitor its own border and apply a sane system of an admission of immigrants. He revived the old Obama nonsense about combating employment with unionized green jobs and leaped into the time warp of bygone days with the bunk that the middle class built the country and the unions built the middle class, and we must promote the right to unionize. Unions today are an almost wholly retrograde force redundant to market pressures for higher wages and better working conditions and largely confined to the stagnant backwater, the public sector. The former administration created huge numbers of millionaires and billionaires who cheat on their taxes, adding $2 trillion of debt and extending the pay disparity between the chief executive and the lowest wage earner to 320 to 1. Naturally ignored were the facts that under his predecessor, the income taxes of 83% of taxpayers were reduced. The number of positions to be filled exceeded the number of unemployed by over 750,000. And the lowest 20% of income earners was, in percentage terms, gaining income more swiftly than the top 10%. He taxed the former administration with trickle-down economics, though that charge was leveled at President Reagan's massively popular and successful economic policies. Most outrageously, Biden took all credit for 220 million vaccinations, with no hint that if it had not been for Trump's direct intervention to accelerate the development of vaccines, none of it would have happened. And maybe perhaps that's a blessing in disguise because, hey, if you want to pin it on somebody, let's pin it on Joe. Deaths included, VAERS, etc. Almost as disingenuous was the claim that House of Representatives Bill No. 1, which would effectively eliminate any serious method of verifying the validity of individual votes, is really an attack on the Republican effort to attack the sacred right to vote. That bill is almost certainly unconstitutional, would institutionalize and protect mass ballot harvesting, and it ignores the fact that 77% of Americans support photo identification for voters. The climate was again bandied in as an existential crisis, even though Biden acknowledged that the U.S. only provides 15% of the world's carbon emissions. He also omitted to mention its splendid record in reducing those emissions. I wonder if they meant emissions, even though there remains no convincing argument that they are relevant to the alleged crisis. Foreign affairs was an unrecognizable dream world, while leading off with our allies and working closely with them to deal with Iran and North Korea, principally by recommending the West to acquiescing in Iran nuclear militarization. He will stand up to Chinese leader Xi, whom he realizes in deadly earnest in his determination to supplant the United States as the world's most important country. After the usual reassertion that everyone is created equal, Biden slipped in the need to root out systemic racism that plagues America. White supremacy is terrorism and has surpassed jihadism as a menace. He gave no hint of what he thinks of organizations that are constantly threatening to burn America down if they're not successful in extracting a full-body immersion and self-humiliation from the majority of Americans who despise all racism. Rarely, in his rapidly Bowdlerized summary of the nation's affairs, does the president allow the truth to intrude. This made the opposition response by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina particularly effective. In sum, Biden's address was cringeworthy, fatuous, and deeply distressing. The State of the Union is almost at suicide watch. And that was picked up and read a couple 100,000 times here over on Zero Hedge in recent days, worthy of sharing, and yes, it was absolutely cringeworthy. No real plan. Again, what do you expect from a fraudulent regime, let's call it that at this point? Nothing about it, frankly, in my mind, has any merit whatsoever. And I think probably 70-some million Americans who voted otherwise probably would agree. So that being said, more on Biden. His stimulus checks wreck labor pool as people get paid to stay home. And again, this goes to my assertion that basically they are covertly implementing MMT, mass monetary theory, which is the very thing we heard people like AOC talk about in the past. You know, she's a professed economist, right? So she must know what is really best, right? Ridiculous. Says there are new concerns that President Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus stimulus package is already harming the labor market recovery. Notice how big these packages are. Why are they all about trillions? What happened to the B? Is it perhaps because the Fed has been printing so much? Stay tuned. I'm going to touch upon that here momentarily as well. Says while job openings and postings are increasing, there is an issue with the number of applications, as labor participation currently stands at 61.4%, with an unemployment rate of 6.2%. People are not applying for jobs as they should be, as they collect stimulus checks and enjoy a work-free lifestyle, all on the backs of taxpayers. Give me my stimmy, I guess is what it is, huh? Says there are many jobs available in manufacturing, trade and transportation, logistics, and the professional sector, but employers have difficulty sourcing workers. The latest comments from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City provide a chilling insight this month into the labor shortage developing at manufacturing firms across Denver, Oklahoma City, and Omaha. Stimulus and increased unemployment money are wrecking the labor pool. Lower-level employees are quitting to make just as much not working. So, lower-level employees are making more money collecting stimulus checks and other handouts under the Biden administration. This was very similar when former President Trump dished out helicopter money during the early days of the pandemic. What this creates are more bottlenecks for the supply chain as labor becomes scarce. It is very difficult to handle the increased business with supply chain issues across all materials and finding anyone who wants to work. The federal government has incentivized people to stay home and not be productive. Other employers report unemployed workers have no incentive to return to work given the COVID bonus payments. What this means is that entry-level pay will have to increase to get low-level workers off the couch. This will create more cost pressures for companies that will either be absorbed or pass on to the consumer. And I guess I'll pause right there because it's just been in the last week or so. And I forget where this was, but maybe it was down in Florida. Can't remember. But there was literally a sign, and I think this was on a fast food joint. They had put out $50 just to come in and interview. $50. You know how many people they got to come in and do that? Zero. Absolutely zero. $50 to come in just for an interview for a job, and they couldn't even do that. This is what the Dem Party brings you. The Biden administration effectively destroys the labor market, resulting in significant repercussions for the real economy, such as a labor shortage that could stall the recovery. In particular, at McDonald's and... here it is. Yeah, I guess this was the article that I was referring to. I forgot that's where I saw it. It says, in particular, a McDonald's in Tampa, Florida offered $50 last week to anyone who would show up to a job interview. Wall Street Journal said labor shortages in the food industry affect nationwide and independent eateries as they can't source enough workers for the front and back end. Some fast food chains are offering signing bonuses. Chipotle Mexican Grill Inc. is offering free college who work at least 15 hours a week. Taco Bell is giving paid family leave to company store managers. Other operators are boosting pay. But even with all the perks, the labor crunch affects many businesses in various industries to retain workers as the stimulus money adds a barrier to bring back low-level workers. JP Morgan recently warned clients of a massive labor shortage in the U.S. And here they highlight the small businesses reporting record unfilled positions. And I can only presume that this represents maybe thousands, millions, not sure. 45. Yeah, I can't tell what the scale is down the side here. SA percent balance versus diffusion index. Okay. So nonetheless, 1974 through 2022, it's at a record high. It says, however, JP Morgan did not expand on what may be causing this unprecedented schism within the economy. After all, for normalcy to return, people must not only be employed, but must want to be employed. It did suggest that the robust government stimulus may be keeping workers on the sidelines. In a letter sent to the White House Friday, Wall Street Journal explains Dems on Capitol Hill are pushing for the Biden administration to make the jobless benefits permanent, the onset to universal basic income. While politicians on Capitol Hill have cheered about people's QE, quantitative easing, since the pandemic began, the consequences of paying low-level workers more to sit at home than to work could derail the economic recovery. Well, and maybe there's another side to this that's not being considered as well. Think of what they're pushing by all these woke corporations doing the bidding of the government at this point as well, right? All the COVID nonsense. Oh, in order to return to the labor force, well, you're going to have to show proof that you've been vaccinated. So here's your little COVID pass, right? Maybe folks are deciding, if my company or corporation and that I work for is going to require that and I've not gotten the jab, what's the likelihood that they're going to return? Maybe it's perhaps a little bit of a blessing in disguise, so it could be read one of two ways. I don't know. We'll have to see how this shakes out. That being said, the adverse consequences of a $15 an hour wage hike, because obviously Joe in his address talked about 15 to drive to 15. Of course, everybody wants to go to 15 as if that's some sort of magic number. Why not make it $100 an hour? What is the true minimum wage? 0, folks. The true minimum wage is 0. You make nothing. Not 15, not 100, not whatever. Anyway, pretty good article penned by Lance Roberts and company over at Real Investment Advice here today. It says, what's the big hubbub over raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour? After all, the last time the U.S. lifted the minimum wage was in 2009. The argument for increasing the minimum is to create a livable wage for those working at that level. However, is that the best way to help the poor? And I would question whether or not even $15 today is going to be enough. Look at the price of all the commodities and that going up. Look at the price of your food and that's about to go up. The stealth shrinkflation, as they call it. Shrinkonomics, where they'll just keep the price the same on the shelf, but just like Costco is going to do, they're just going to hack off about 20 extra sheets out of that roll of paper towels, but charge you the same, hoping that you won't notice, right? They did the very same thing back in 2008 on a number of things. Your OJ went from 64 ounces down to 59 ounces. Your cereal boxes probably jet-packed more air than content and skinnied up the boxes while keeping the price the same. You name it. Same thing's going to happen this time. The Biden administration wants to include an increase of the minimum wage in the proposed infrastructure plan. Many may forget the attempt to hike the minimum wage during his tenure as VP with the Obama administration. At that time, there was such an immense level of table pounding, you would assume a majority of Americans got trapped at minimum wage. However, let's take a look at some numbers. It says how many work for a minimum wage? Well, according to the latest available annual data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2019, 82.3 million workers aged 16 and older in the United States were paid at hourly rates, representing 58.1% of all wage and salary workers. Among those paid by the hour, 392,000 workers earned exactly the prevailing federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. About 1.2 million had wages below the federal minimum. Together, these 1.6 million workers with wages at or below the federal minimum made up 1.9% of all hourly paid workers, so less than 2%. Notably, that 1.9% of minimum wage or less workers declined 50% from the same report in April 2015. So in 2014, 77.2 million workers aged 16 and older in the United States were paid at hourly rates, representing 58.7% of all wage and salaried workers. Among those paid by the hour, 1.3 million earned exactly the prevailing federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. About 1.7 million had wages below the federal minimum. Together, these 3 million workers with wages at or below the federal minimum wage made up 3.9% of all hourly paid workers. So obviously in those two contexts there, we can see from 2014 to 2019 that basically we lost a couple percent, right? Meaning people probably improved themselves, got better jobs, and actually made more than $7.25 an hour, right? Logic, reason. Notably, this number has been reduced drastically from the 13.4% of workers earning minimum wage in 1979. Of those 1.6 million workers, 49% were aged 19 to 25, according to the KFF organization. And here's the demographics net spelled out. Young adults ages 19 to 25, female, Hispanic, black, non-Hispanic, etc., etc. Looking at it in terms of low-wage workers in dark blue and all workers in the lighter blue on the right. So not surprisingly, we primarily find these individuals in the fast food, retail, and service industries. Well, yeah, stands to reason, and look at what the lion's share of economy is after hollowing it out due to NAFTA and manufacturing getting shipped off to other countries. Shouldn't be too big of a surprise, right? So here's your top 10 occupations among low-wage workers 2018. Everything from cashiers to retail salesperson, cooks, waiters, waitresses, customer service reps, laborers and freight, stock and material movers, janitors, building cleaners, stockers, order fillers, drivers, sales workers, truck drivers, teaching assistants, etc., etc. So what? So what? People working at restaurants need to make more money. Okay, well, let's hike the minimum wage to $15 an hour. That doesn't sound like that big of a deal. Let's do the math. My son turned 16 last November and got his first job. He works as a packer/runner for a local restaurant to pack orders for pickup due to COVID-19 seating restrictions. Importantly, he has no experience. He also has no idea what working actually means and is about to experience the cruel joke of taxes. However, let's do the math at $15 an hour, assuming he works full-time this summer. So $15 an hour times 40 hours a week is about $600 a week. $600 a week times 4.3 weeks in a month equals about $25.80 a month. $25.80 a month times 12 months equals about $30,960 a year. Let that soak in for a minute. We're talking about paying $30,000 a year to a 16-year-old to run food out to customers. Now that salary would put him in the top 1% of wage earners globally. Now, let's expand the math to the current situation. So we got 1.9 million workers, about $31,000 a year roughly, assuming all workers work full time. Assuming everyone worked previously at $7.50 an hour, wages increased by $29.4 billion over the year. So an increase in wages of $29.4 billion will either get passed on to consumers at higher costs or the number of jobs decline. So the trickle-up effect. According to PayScale, the median hourly wage for a restaurant manager is about $13 an hour. And here we see some of the graphics depicting that. It says, what do you think happens when my son, with no experience, is making more than the restaurant manager? The owner will have to increase the manager's salary. But wait, now the manager is making more than the district manager, which requires another pay hike, so forth and so on. Of course, none of this is a problem as long as you can pass on higher payroll benefits and rising healthcare costs to the consumer. So small businesses already noticing? But that is a problem already, as the National Foundation of Independent Business, NFIB, noted in a recent survey. To wit, yes, injecting stimulus into the economy will provide a short-term increase in demand for goods and services. And when the funds are exhausted, the demand fades. However, small business owners understand the limited impact of artificial inputs. As such, they will not make long-term hiring decisions and ongoing cost against a short-term artificial increase in demand. Also, given President Biden is focused on more government regulation and higher taxes, which falls squarely on the creators of employment, increased costs will further deter long-term hiring plans. And so here we see the top 3 concerns of small businesses. And single most important problem, percent reporting, is taxes, percent reporting government requirements, and percent reporting poor sales. Those are the 3 highlighted here. So such was explicitly a point made by the Congressional Budget Office as well. Higher wages would increase the cost to employers of producing goods and services. employers would pass some of those increased costs on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Those higher prices, in turn, would lead consumers to purchase fewer goods and services. Employers would consequently produce fewer goods and services. As a result, they would tend to reduce their employment of workers at all wage levels. When the cost of employing low-wage workers goes up, the relative cost of employing higher-wage workers or investing in machines and technology goes down. Some employers would therefore respond to a higher minimum wage by shifting towards those substitutes and reducing their employment of low-wage workers. So have we been here before? Well, that analysis dovetailed with previous research from the Manhattan Institute when the Obama administration tried lifting the minimum wage previously. By eliminating jobs and or reducing employment growth, economists have long understood that adoption of a higher minimum wage can harm the very poor who are intended to be helped. But this groundbreaking paper by Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum and former director of the Congressional Budget Office, and Ben Gittes, director of labor market policy at the American Action Forum, comes to a strikingly different conclusion. Overall employment growth will be lower as a result of a higher minimum wage. Furthermore, much of the increase in income that results for those fortunate enough to have jobs would go to relatively higher income households. It would not help those households in poverty in whose name the campaign for a higher minimum wage gets waged. So, problems with hiking the minimum wage? Well, a number of things. It says raising the minimum wage has a variety of effects on both employment and family income. By increasing the cost of employing low-wage workers, a higher minimum wage generally leads employers to reduce the size of their workforce. And the effects of unemployment would cause changes in prices and different labor and capital types. By boosting the income of low-wage workers who keep their jobs, a higher minimum wage raises their families' real income, lifting some families out of poverty. However, real income falls for some families because other workers lose their jobs. Business owners lose income and prices increase for consumers. And I guess I'll pause right there and suggest that perhaps a slight microcosm of this recently played out in places like Seattle. And if I'm not mistaken, there's been some cities in that as well in California that have played this out. But look at what they just did with the whole COVID business, right? This COVID risk, right? Kroger's, I think, was a good example in California recently where they said, because they are engaged with the populace net and having to deal with the population and COVID, well, we're going to mandate that you're going to have to pay your workers more. And how did Kroger's respond? They promptly shut down 2 stores and left 1 open to compensate, right? And the same was true in Seattle here, if I'm not mistaken, that they raised wages by edict and decree of their local government. And of course, what happened? Well, all the eateries and that they thought were going to be so much the more and better off, well, a number of them closed. And that's their understanding of economics, folks. They don't understand it. They think they're helping folks. They're technically not. And maybe that's all by design at the end of the day. I don't know. Or just the fact that they're idiots. Net impact. The net effect of a minimum wage increase is to reduce average real family income. Minimum wage impact on employment. Well, higher wages increase the cost to employers of producing goods and services. The employers pass some of these increased costs on to consumers, you and I, in the form of higher prices. Those higher prices in turn lead consumers to purchase fewer goods and services. The employers consequently produce fewer goods and services, reducing their employment of low-wage and higher-wage workers. And when the cost of employing low-wage workers goes up, the relative cost of hiring higher-wage workers or investing in machines and technology goes down. So what's the net impact? Well, an increase in the minimum wage affects those components in offsetting ways. It increases the cost of employing new hires for firms, reduces the cost of higher wage workers and productivity-increasing technology, makes firms raise wages for all current employees whose salaries are below the new minimum, regardless of whether new workers get hired. And of course, we see via the picture here, yeah, this is exactly what's going to happen. Instead of actually hiring more bodies or keeping said bodies and paying them more, well, suddenly capital, because of the price of technology that has come down in recent years, this now makes more sense. So minimum wage increases affects across employers. Employers vary in how they respond to a minimum wage increase. Employment tends to fall more at firms whose sales decline when they raise prices. Also at firms that can readily substitute machines or technology for low-wage workers. They might reduce workers' fringe benefits such as health insurance or pensions, and job perks such as employee discounts. Such lessens the effect of the higher minimum wage on total compensation. Employers could also partly offset their higher costs by cutting back on training. They could also opt to assign work to independent contractors who the FLSA does not cover. Net impact: employers respond to higher minimum wages by cutting costs or benefits elsewhere. Conclusion: so should we raise the minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to say $9 an hour? Probably. The cost of living has risen since the 2009 wage hike, and an increase would likely be more palatable than a doubling. However, while a drastic hike to $15 sounds innocent enough, it has the most significant negative impact on the poor, as reported by the Foundation for Economic Freedom. Minimum wage laws create a barrier to getting a job that the privileged are better able to overcome than the underprivileged. When jobs are scarce, then immigrants, workers with few skills or little education, and those with limited English proficiency are going to have a harder time convincing employers that your labor is worth $15 an hour than their better skilled native English-speaking competitors. As Thomas Leonard has recently shown, unemploying such marginalized groups are regarded as part of the point of minimum wage laws by early 20th century progressives who saw the minimum wage as a useful tool for keeping immigrants, blacks, and women out of the labor market. Notably, the unintended consequences of a minimum wage hike in a weak economic environment are not inconsequential. Given that businesses are already fighting for profitability, hiking the minimum wage, given the subsequent trickle-up effect, will lead to further increases in productivity and a reduction in employment. So there you have it, in a nutshell. Fairly well explained, I thought, by Lance Roberts and company over at Real Investment Advice. Always fairly insightful, but again, what do you expect out of the Dems and the AOC types here? Well, and again, if the incentive is to sit in your butt and just collect a stimmy check, well, then what's the point, right? Why worry about a $15 minimum wage? I don't know. We'll have to see how it shakes out, but obviously I would rather be doing something more fruitful with my time. Anyway, so that being said, it takes us to this little graphic, very interesting graphic, Fred graphic here out of the Federal Reserve, which is called the M3 for the United States. And what this represents is the total money supply in circulation. So what you're looking at here is dating back to just before January of 2010. We were hovering right around, about $1 trillion, just under $1 trillion or so, and monies circulating around in the forms of greenbacks, coinage, whatever. Then we bounced clear over to just after January 2020 and the precipitous hike in that we have seen. Now, what actually occurred at this point? Well, is that not where the old COVID quote-unquote plandemic began, the shamdemic? And then the Federal Reserve decided to go on a money printing spree, out of thin air, mind you. And of course, right now, we are probably just over about $4 trillion or so, somewhere thereabouts. So, when you hear me say that we have added in the last 12 plus months over $3 trillion into printed out of thin air into circulation, then you start to understand why the prices of everything have gone up. I think the actual run rate for this version of QE, that they're not calling QE, quantitative easing, has been north of about $180 billion a month. and continues. Now, granted, they're starting to taper off and have done so. You can see by the knee in the curve there. But nonetheless, that's a hell of a lot of dollars floating out there in circulation. And it's so absolutely ridiculous at this point that they're running out of places to invest it. And why you're seeing SPACs and NFTs and all this other fringe garbage and other derivative shenanigans go on. So it paints a case for gold. As you well know, I'm a big proponent of gold because at the end of the day, gold has a history. It's been around for eons. It's proven. And so gold is laughing at Powell. This out of goldswitzerland.com via Matthew Piepenberg. Says recently my colleague Egon von Greyers and I had some unabashed yet blunt fun calling out the staggering levels of open hypocrisy and policy desperation unleashed by former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan. Poor Alan was an easy target of what I described as the patient zero of the reckless interest rate suppression and unbridled monetary expansion policies of the Fed, which have always led to equally reckless boom and bust cycles in markets and economies. And of course, if you look at what is playing out here today, we have the bubble of all bubbles. It's more or less considered the everything bubble at this point. Much like back in the early 2000s, we had the dot-com bubble, and then, of course, we had the bubble around 2008, which was the housing bubble. Now, today, the bubble is just blown astronomically high on every damn thing out there. It says, but let us be fair to comical Fed Chairman like Greenspan, as he is not alone in making a mockery of his post at the Eccles building. With the exception of Paul Volcker and William Martin, the sad truth is that nearly every person who sat in that lead chair of a private bank, masquerading as a Federal Reserve, has made the bank and themselves a public embarrassment. As a legendary private investor, Jim Rogers, recently observed on Kitco News, almost all central bankers effectively lie and obfuscate facts as part of their job description and job preservation at the Fed. So there you have it. A central banker's job description. For the most part, overhyped Fed chairs know how to run up debt levels and create lots of money to appear accommodative to markets in the short term and then blame animal spirits on the disasters which always follow longer term. In fact, if I had to come up with the most honest and historically confirmed job description for a Fed chairman, I would post the following job post on LinkedIn. Seeking DC. Based expert, fluent in doublespeak, comfortable with unsustainable debt expansion, and handy with a money printer. Ivy League credentials A+. Sounds about right. The latest nonsense from Powell. As far as doublespeak, Mr. Powell is now seeking to outshine old Mr. Greenspan's art of spin with studying Elon. At a recent economics club in Washington, Powell was both shameless and brilliant in his ability to spew fantasy with the skill of a circus promoter, yet maintain the straight face of a circuit judge. Specifically, Powell tried to downplay the U.S. debt elephant in the room by admitting to its horrific size, yet promising a miracle policy shift sometime down the road. That is, he was unable to deny what he describes as the unsustainable path of current U.S. debt levels growing meaningfully faster than economic growth, but was quick to comfort anyone gullible enough to believe him that for now there is no question of our ability to service our debt for the foreseeable future. Service our debt? Hell, we can barely pay the interest at this point. But hey, we're good for it, right? Such calming words, such confidence, such market-placating guidance. A brief translation of Fed speak. But now, let's translate Powell's Fed speak into real speak and get a deeper look into the mind of a first-rate spin seller. When Powell says there is no question of our ability to service our debt for the foreseeable future, he is actually telling a kind of partial truth. Congratulations, Jerome. Yes, so long as the Fed decides to print trillions more fiat dollars and artificially cap yields and interest rates, the Fed can indeed service its nearly $30 trillion in public debt for the quote-unquote foreseeable future, as the cost of that debt is forced to the basement of history. But what Powell forgets to say, quite cleverly, is that the quote-unquote foreseeable future, of which he is telegraphing, is nothing more than a future of equally foreseeable and grotesquely expanded, and hence debased U.S. dollars. which is needed to monetize that truly unsustainable debt. Needless to say, such money printing is great news for gold. But Powell's ability to spin fantasy gets even more pronounced with his next great lie masquerading as policy comfort. Specifically, and to wit, Powell then says, in the same breath, that at some point in the distant future, when the economy is in better shape, the Fed will then be in a better position to deal with the debt issue then. Ah, that's just wonderful, no? At some point in the distant future, the Fed will magically deal with our debt issue. Did Powell take a math course, read a history book? But here's the problem with Powell's kindergarten logic and truth-challenged phraseology. The quote-unquote distant future of quote-unquote economic growth is mathematically and historically impossible. Impossible. Why? Because once a nation crosses the Rubicon of 100% debt to GDP, and once a nation's currency has lost greater than 98% of its inherent value due to fiat money expansion, as is the case today, economic growth has never, not once, in the entire history of the financial world, ever occurred. Stated more simply, that distant future of economic growth in which the Fed deals with our debt problem is an open lie, no different than Bernanke's 2009 promise that QE1 was temporary and would end by 2010. And of course we went on to QE2, QE3, and QE4, and of course one might surmise we are already on QE5. Says if Powell would like, I am happy to send him for Monsignor Greenspan and Bernanke a few high school textbooks on basic math, or maybe one or two essays on market history to help him and them regain both a conscience and facts. Jerome, my web link is found below. Don't forget the endless Larry Summers. But let us not just poke fun at central bankers' struggles with history and math. Our increasingly sordid world of so-called financial leadership hardly ends at Constitution Avenue. My former Harvard president and one-time Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, for example, is no less of a master at promoting his image while ignoring his mistakes. Mr. Summers, the godfather of deregulating the otherwise toxic, uber-levered, and price-fixing over-the-counter derivatives market, deserves an honorable mention. Under his watch in 1998, the derivatives market went from $95 trillion to $670 trillion, despite open warnings from Brooksley Born at the CFTC. Meanwhile, Summers was openly insulting her while slapping backs with bankers and promising the world not to worry about their master's plan to expand this once safe futures exchange. But less than a decade after telling Congress that he and his banker friends were more than capable of managing OTC derivatives risk, that same market, as well as the S&P and the Harvard Endowment, tanked by greater than 50% in a matter of weeks in 2008. And oh, by the way, I'll pause right there to say, and if you're paying any sort of attention at all, you'll know that Greensill, as well as Wirecard and the EU, are basically doing the same doggone thing. And then we had Huang here, stateside with Archegos, do the very same thing. He was basically playing with other people's money and walking away, and they assumed all the risk, like Credit Suisse. And they have gone so far as letting the heads roll of some high-ups, as well as even potentially their board of directors not having some heads roll, including the CEO. In fact, he specifically observed that the U.S. has embarked on one of the least responsible macroeconomic policies that the U.S. has had in the last 40 years. Well, Larry, maybe the current inflationary direction of the U.S. is the worst thing seen in the last 40 years, but rest assured of this. Your deregulation of the openly toxic derivatives market comes in at a close second for some of the worst policies I've seen in the last 40 years. So turning to gold. Well, one thing which folks like Powell and even Summers can agree is that there will be lots more money printing and debt expansion to come. For those of us who can see through Fed speak and track facts rather than fictions, there are two factors favorable to gold, rather than just golden tongues. which we can smile upon for the next foreseeable 5 years, namely more growth in the broad money supply and more negative real interest rates. As for the money supply, we have written about its promiscuous expansion at length everywhere, but in case you're curious what it looks like, just see for yourself. And here's another look at the money supply increase. This is looking at it in currency in circulation, billions of dollars, yeah. So a different look than the previous Fred one that I showed you a minute ago. But as for negative real, in effect, inflation-adjusted rates, we've also written at length about how well gold shines when inflation rates outpace yields on U.S. Treasury bonds. As Powell has already told us, repressed bond yields and repressed rates are inevitable in the coming years for no other reason that the Fed can't afford for those rates to go much higher. Period. Full stop. And as for inflation outpacing those repressed rates, that too is no longer theoretical or debatable, as inflation is measured by the expansion of the money supply rather than the fictional math of the CPI scale, which, despite even its openly bogus reporting, cannot hide the inflationary signals coming from commodity prices, rising M1 and M2 data, and increased governmental control of the banking system. In short, the foreseeable future is clearly one that favors inflation outpacing yields and thus smiling upon gold. So getting technical, aside from such historically and fundamentally confirmed tailwinds for this misunderstood precious metal, even the technical indicators are making gold smile. Looking at last week's daily price action in gold, we can see that after last August 2070 gold high, the subsequent and expected gold correction has both found and bounced off its technical support/bottom. As the chart below confirms, gold reversed off a double bottom line far right of historical support twice in March. And of course, you probably can't really read that, but here today I think it's closing somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1770, 1780 and change, perhaps on its way back up. It says, in addition to a critical double bounce off support, the daily gold price broke through and then closed consecutively above a technical resistance band in April. Having broken resistance, gold pricing then created a new trend line up and to the right. And such a bounce off a double bottom pattern plus consecutive price close confirmations above resistance is a classic chart confirmation of an upward technical direction in gold, and which may be of interest to those who trade this oh-so-precious metal. For us, a triple bottom support would have been better, and price swings near term for gold are not outlawed. Of course, we remain largely agnostic to the short-term price action of gold, as we see it as an investment rather than a speculation. Far more importantly, we see gold as the ultimate answer to the emotional fact that fiat currencies are losing their punch by the second. Gold will rise much higher simply because the dollar's purchasing power will sink far lower. Thus, despite the fictional distant future and economic growth of which Powell spoke above, we see an all too real distant future of increasing debt, increasing money supply, and hence increasing open and obvious currency debasement. Given the facts above, we hope our words make more sense than Powell's. So, last but not least, in regards to this, we got this nugget that came through. Here are the best performing assets in April and year to date. And I'm not going to read all this, but what I am going to do is I'm going to highlight the charts here. Egg spot index, nah, we'll skip over that. Bottom line will take us down to here. And take a look at, let's see if this comes up. There we go. Figure 1 is the total return performance of major global financial assets in April in local currency. The dark blue is corporate bonds, government bonds, equity, EM bonds, commodities, FX, currencies, etc., etc. Bottom line, copper is way up, as we would expect. In April, copper prices way up. And, of course, we saw silver up, Brent up. S&P gold was up slightly, about 4%. 12% is the high, as measured by copper here. Total return performance of major global financial assets in April in U.S. dollars. Here you see that up about 12%, still kind of following the same trend. Let me go back to the year-to-date look at things. and show, at least at this point, Brent and copper are to the good, and so far gold and silver and company are still on the negative side of things here. But I'm guessing, based on the report that we just read, that probably is going to change. One of the things that I don't think was really talked about too terribly much in regards to Gold Switzerland's article was the fact that spot prices and everything else. You got to remember too, what it boils down to is this: is that those prices are manipulated at the end of the day. You've got the folks over in London, just like they have got the interest rates and that they can set every single day. The interbank stuff, they do the very same thing with spot prices. And of course, on top of that, you've got the paper contracts, the EFTs. So I believe the last figure I saw was silver, as an example here in recent days. I think there are at least 1,000 paper ounces to every one single available ounce, something along those lines, which means really it's all speculative stuff. There are never going to be enough gold ounces, silver ounces available to cover every single contract out there. And that has also helped to keep the price levels net down. So, that being said, we are in for some very interesting times. Certainly, it's one of the things that I'm watching behind the scenes. Hopefully, you guys are staying abreast of this and guarding yourself appropriately as a lot of this inflation takes place, which you're never going to hear the Mockingbird media say a word about. Obviously, we're not going to get a straight answer out of Jay Powell, who thinks that all inflation is quote-unquote transitory, whatever the hell that means. You can see it with your very own eyes, folks. So, that being said, that's going to do it for this broadcast here this evening. As always, I appreciate you guys tuning in. We're going to have more here in the coming days as well. And look for me here shortly to start kicking off Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. We'll start delving into that here shortly as well. Until then, take care, God bless, and we'll see you back next time, everybody.